Ready for a deep dive? We're tackling psychotherapy today, and wow, you weren't kidding about that stack of materials. Schools of thought, therapy styles, all the skills a therapist needs. It's a lot.
It really is fascinating, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. But let's back up for a sec. When most people hear psychotherapy, they probably picture that classic image patient on the couch, Freud-like figure talking about childhood.
It's iconic, for sure, but also a bit misleading. Psychotherapy is so much more diverse than that one image suggests. There's a huge range of approaches because, well, the human mind is complex.
That's a good point. It's not like there's one magic solution that works for every single person.
Exactly. It's about finding the right approach for each individual and their unique challenges.
So how do we even define psychotherapy? What sets it apart from just talking to a friend?
It's a structured process, for one thing, and it involves a trained therapist, someone who understands human behavior, different techniques, ethical guidelines. It's not just about giving advice, it's about empowering the client to understand themselves and address their challenges in a safe, supportive environment.
It's interesting you mentioned trained therapist. That makes me think about the different schools of thought within psychology. We were going through those materials earlier, and it's amazing how many different perspectives there are on how the mind actually works.
It can be a lot to wrap your head around. You've got everything from those early schools like structuralism and functionalism.
Right. It's like, how do you even begin to understand the mind? Do you break it down into its smallest parts, like individual thoughts and sensations?
Which is very much the structuralist approach, analyzing the building blocks, so to speak.
Well, functionalism is more about
The why behind it all. How do those thoughts and feelings actually help us navigate the world? What's their purpose? It's like looking at a house, and instead of focusing on the bricks, you're interested in how those bricks come together to create a functional living space.
and how people use that space, their habits, their routines, all of that.
Exactly. And these different perspectives have a huge impact on how we think about therapy. Do we try to analyze every single thought in isolation? Or do we focus on how those thoughts influence someone's behavior and overall well-being? It's a big question.
Then you've got behaviorism, which seems to chuck the whole house analogy out the window.
Right. Behaviorism is all about observable actions, how our environment shapes our behavior through learned responses. Less about what's going on inside, more about what we can see and measure.
So if someone's struggling with social anxiety, a behaviorist wouldn't be as interested in exploring the root causes of those anxious feelings.
It's more about identifying the triggers, the specific situations that provoke that anxiety, and then working to modify the behavioral response.
Fascinating. So we've gone from analyzing the bricks to understanding the purpose of the house to now focusing on the landscaping and how we interact with the world around us.
And then cognitive psychology comes in and brings the focus back to those internal processes, but in a more systematic way.
Yeah.
It recognizes that how we think directly impacts how we feel and ultimately how we act.
Our thoughts are like those internal architects, shaping our emotional landscape.
Exactly. And that's a key principle underlying a lot of modern therapies, particularly CBT.
CBT, that seems to be everywhere these days.
It's incredibly popular, and for good reason. It gives people practical tools to understand and challenge those often unhelpful thought patterns that can lead to anxiety, depression, all sorts of challenges.
Like that all or nothing thinking you mentioned earlier. It's so easy to fall into those traps without even realizing it. I messed up this presentation. I'm a complete failure.
Exactly. And CBT gives you a framework to challenge those thoughts.
Yeah.
Is that thought really true? What's the evidence? Is there a more balanced way to look at this?
Reframing the narrative, replacing those distorted thoughts with something more realistic. I love that. But before we dive into specific therapies, there's one more thing we should touch on, and it comes up again and again in these materials.
The therapeutic relationship itself?
Yes. You could have the most experienced therapist, the most cutting-edge techniques.
But if there's no trust, no genuine connection,
It's unlikely to be as effective. That human element is crucial. It really makes you think about the whole nature of therapy. It's not just about having a toolbox of techniques. It's about creating a space where those techniques can actually land, you know?
Absolutely. It's like fertile ground. You can have the best seeds in the world, but if the soil isn't right, they're not going to grow.
Love that analogy. So let's talk about those seeds, those different approaches. We touched on CBT earlier, which seems to be having a real moment.
It's incredibly effective for a lot of people. That focus on identifying and challenging those negative thought patterns, it really resonates.
It's like you're retraining your brain to think differently.
Exactly. And it's not just about feeling better. It's about understanding those thought patterns, where they come from, how they're impacting you. It's empowering.
So with CBT, you're really getting into the nitty-gritty of those thought distortions, right?
Absolutely. Like, let's say you make a mistake at work and you immediately jump to, I'm incompetent, I'm going to get fired, my life is over. That's classic catastrophizing.
Been there. It's amazing how quickly our minds can spiral.
Right. But with CBT, you learn to pause, to examine that thought. Okay, is that thought really true? What's the evidence? Am I really going to get fired over this one mistake? Usually the answer is no.
And even if it is a possibility, it doesn't mean your whole life is over.
Exactly. It's about bringing a more balanced, realistic perspective to those thoughts.
So we've got CBT, which is all about rewiring those thought patterns. What about humanistic therapy? That seems to come from a completely different place.
It does. If CBT is about changing the way we think, humanistic therapy is more about creating the optimal conditions for growth. It emphasizes things like empathy, unconditional positive regard, the client's inherent capacity for healing.
So it's less about fixing what's wrong and more about,
Supporting the individual to become the best version of themselves. It's about recognizing that each person has a unique path, and the therapist's role is to help them tap into their own inner wisdom.
it's beautiful in a way, trusting that people have within them what they need to heal and grow.
Exactly. And that's not to say it's always easy. Therapy can be challenging work no matter the approach. But with humanistic therapy, there's this underlying belief in the client's potential, even when they might not see it themselves.
That's powerful. So we've got these two very different approaches, CBT, which is very structured and focused on changing thoughts, and humanistic therapy, which is more about creating a supportive environment for self-discovery. What I'm hearing is that it's not an either situation.
Exactly. More and more, therapists are taking an integrative approach, drawing from different schools of thought to create a truly personalized experience for each client.
Like a bespoke suit, you're not trying to fit everyone into the same mold.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that each person is unique, and their therapy should reflect that.
It makes perfect sense. But no matter what approach a therapist uses, there are certain core skills that are essential, right?
Absolutely. Those materials you sent over highlighted some really important ones: active listening, empathy.
I'd love to dig into those a bit because they seem so fundamental. What does active listening really look like in a therapy session?
It's so much more than just hearing the words someone is saying. It's about really tuning in to their tone of voice, their body language, the emotions that might be underneath the surface.
Holding space for the whole person.
Yes,
Yep.
and reflecting that understanding back to them. Not just nodding along, but really letting them know that you're hearing them, seeing them, getting where they're coming from.
It creates a sense of safety, of being truly heard.
Exactly. And that's where empathy comes in, which is really about connecting with another person's emotional experience.
Stepping into their shoes, even if you haven't lived their exact experiences.
Right. It's about recognizing their feelings as valid and understandable. And that doesn't mean you agree with everything they say or do.
But you can still empathize with where they're coming from.
Exactly. And those core skills, while essential, are just the beginning. Your materials also touch on some more complex aspects of therapy, like assessment and treatment planning.
The nuts and bolts of it all. It's easy to forget that therapy is a structured process, not just casual conversation. And then there's the whole idea of resistance and transference. Those always felt a bit mysterious to me. It's like those terms belong in a psychology textbook, but when you actually think about what they mean in the context of therapy, it's pretty intense.
It really highlights the depth of the therapeutic process, doesn't it? We're talking about unconscious patterns, past experiences resurfacing.
And the therapist has to be able to navigate all of that. What does resistance actually look like in therapy? Is it like a client refusing to talk?
It can manifest in so many ways. Sometimes it's as blatant as you described, avoiding certain topics, showing up late, maybe even canceling appointments.
So it's not always about what's being said, it's the actions too.
Exactly. But sometimes it's much more subtle. A client might seem engaged intellectually, but they struggle to make any real changes in their life.
They're stuck. But it's not always conscious, is it?
Often it's not. And that's why it's so important for therapists to be able to recognize resistance, not as a personal attack, but as a potential signpost.
A signpost pointing to something that needs attention.
Precisely. It often comes up when the therapy is getting close to something painful or uncomfortable, something the client might not be ready to face yet.
That makes sense. And transference, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one. So it's
Yeah.
like a client might start treating the therapist as if they're someone from their past.
In a nutshell, yes. Imagine a client who had a very critical parent growing up. They might start to perceive the therapist as critical as well, even if the therapist is doing their best to be supportive and non-judgmental.
Wow. So it's like those past relationships are creating a lens through which the client sees the world.
And the therapeutic relationship, which is why it's such sacred ground. We're talking about people at their most vulnerable, sharing their deepest fears, insecurities.
It makes confidentiality absolutely paramount.
Absolutely. It's a cornerstone of the entire therapeutic process. Clients need to know that what they share in that room stays in that room.
With a few very specific exceptions, right?
Right. There are legal and ethical obligations that therapists have to adhere to. If a client is a danger to themselves or others, for example,
Then confidentiality has to be broken.
it's about preventing harm, ensuring everyone's safety. But those situations are rare. Most of the time, what happens in therapy stays in therapy.
It's good to have that reassurance. Another important aspect of ethical practice that came up in those materials is cultural competence. It's a good reminder that a therapist's background and life experiences might be very different from their clients.
It's crucial. Therapy can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. A culturally competent therapist understands that a client's background, beliefs, values, all of that can impact their experience in therapy.
And what they need from that experience.
Exactly. It's about being sensitive to those differences, tailoring your approach accordingly, being willing to learn and challenge your own biases.
Creating a space of true understanding and respect. It's amazing how much ground we've covered, from the history of psychotherapy to all these different approaches and the essential skill. It really is a fascinating field.
And constantly evolving. Who knows what new approaches and techniques will emerge in the years to come?
It makes you wonder, with all the technological advancements we're seeing, will we ever reach a point where therapy can be automated?
It's a question a lot of people are asking. And honestly, I don't have the answer. But I do know there's something incredibly powerful about the human connection that happens in therapy. That feeling of being truly seen and heard, of having someone walk alongside you on your journey. That's hard to replicate with technology.
It really is. There's a certain magic to that therapeutic relationship, something that goes beyond words. Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty deep dive on psychotherapy for today.
We've barely scratched the surface.
True. But I think we've given our listeners a good foundation to build on. As always, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the world with curiosity and an open mind. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.